Now, the businessman Elon Musk has often described himself as a free speech absolutist, especially when it comes to the way he runs his social media site X. But is free speech increasingly crossing a line into disinformation, which fuels things like violent protests? Should social media companies be put under more regulation to help deal with the issue? Well, let's speak to Dr. Suzanne Witten, who's an expert in political theory at Queen's University Belfast. And also with us is Dr. Paul Riley, who works in the area of media democracy at Glasgow University. So firstly then, Paul, where do you think we are in terms of disinformation?
I think what we've seen in the last few weeks is that online platforms clearly have not had a handle or control on this. It is clearly contributed to violence. There's been a lot of hate speech and disinformation. So we're probably heading towards some form of regulation. I'd imagine the Online Safety Act in particular will be expedited, and we'll certainly see more restrictions placed on what people can and cannot say on online platforms.
Do you think new legislation will do the trick then? Because it's proven very difficult to regulate social media platforms more closely in the past.
I think it is tricky because most of the measures to date have been about fines and penalties, and that obviously hasn't improved the rates of removing content deemed harmful or illegal. I think the problem is that the Online Safety Act does have a measure in it which says you cannot share disinformation knowingly, but of course how you enforce that, how you establish intent is quite problematic. And I think we've seen that with some of the cases over the last few weeks where people have often shared things which they often claim not to be doing with malintent. So it is very difficult to regulate.
Suzanne, do you think the online world has been reshaping what people regard as freedom of speech?
Yeah, I mean, on a very basic level, I think we need to remind ourselves of why freedom of speech is so important. It's essential for human flourishing. We're socially interdependent creatures who rely on interaction with one another as that fundamental component of our freedom. But that doesn't mean that freedom of speech and the goods that we get out of freedom of speech happen in a vacuum. It requires certain conditions in place in order to flourish in the way that we want. And this is a point that John Stuart Mill even made on Liberty. So the non-interference with speech from the state is only part of the equation. We really need to foster a good free speech culture if we're going to really get those benefits out of it.
And how do you do that then, Suzanne?
Well, Mill does talk about this on Liberty. Of course, he was talking in a different time. We already have a lot of things in place, a rich free speech infrastructure that helps us get the best out of speech. So journalistic practices, legacy and independent media, mass literacy in education, and rights concerning access to shared public spaces. These are all key components of a free speech culture that we all sort of take for granted now. So while having the opportunity to express your opinion is a really important aspect of speech, it really isn't the whole story.
Yeah, Paul, what role do you think independent media potentially could play in all of this?
Well, I think they play an important role in terms of fact-checking. I think in terms of where people get information from. I mean, more now than ever, I think we probably need to have independent media who are holding people like Elon Musk to account. And I think that the big question we have here is, again, how do people check things they see online? And also, do they check them before they share them? And I think, as we see in recent weeks, that can have very, very negative effects in terms of violence and racial hatred. So independent media is important, but again, it's only one part of the solution. We also have issues here about literacy, also about public discourse. And I think that's very important to highlight, that a lot of the things that have been shared have been amplified by politicians, commentators, and that has a negative impact too. So there's a lot of things in play here.
Do you think, Paul, that really sometimes when it comes to social media, there are people who behave like idiots in real life and they will do the same online, and there's just not very much you can do about that?
Possibly. I mean, I think what's difficult to establish is that there is probably some evidence here of manipulation and coordination. I mean, we've had a lot of evidence of so-called Russian bot farms being linked to violence or elections or attempts to interfere with them. But also you have people who, even with good intent, do share things and don't think about it, or do say things that they think are not public. And that comes down to the issue, perhaps, that some people think that online speech is not the same as offline, when it is one and the same thing. So yeah, some people I think perhaps don't think before they post, and that can be very, very negative in terms of some of the jail sentences we've seen in the past few weeks.
Suzanne, what about who is and isn't allowed on social media? So back when X was called Twitter, there were bans put in place for some very high profile users, including Donald Trump, because the company just felt that they were spreading too much information. It was causing too much trouble. And some of them have been allowed back on X now, as it's called. Should social media companies be deciding who gets to use and doesn't use its services?
I think one thing we need to consider here is that built into the free speech tradition is the idea that human beings have autonomy and that we should be protected in the freedom to weigh up and assess information ourselves before we decide how to act. So when people decide to use information they've been given from one of these people to act in a criminal manner, we would think that the best thing to do is to hold that individual responsible for behaving in that criminal manner. So it's not to say that we sit back and do nothing about harmful mis and disinformation, but what these conversations often leave out is a serious discussion about how people come to follow these sorts of characters in the first place. Beliefs don't just stick to people that they come into contact with. We use our own reason to reflect on those beliefs. So often those authorities are going to be people that we have maybe emotional or affective attachments to, and maybe we need to look more closely at why people are following these authorities in the first place.
Paul, what do you make of Elon Musk's kind of self-bestowed title as a free speech absolutist? Do you think that phrase might give people the impression that it's okay just to post whatever they like?
I think, he doesn't define what that means in ways, and I think that's expedient. And I think it's fair to say that what Elon Musk defines as free speech, others might not. And again, in terms of his own behaviour on this platform, he has sued, journalists, tried to silence others, yet at the same time he does often claim to be this champion of free speech. So I think a lot of people certainly who've been very angered by some of the social media related offences in the last few weeks have often turned him as some champion of this, but it's not clearly defined what is meant by that. And as Suzanne says rightly, very often those in political office and political power and with influence define free speech according to their own interests, and often other people follow. So Musk is not an independent arbiter of what is free speech. I think it's also fair to say, based on the last few weeks, of some of the things that he himself has said on Twitter X.
And Paul, we've spoken about regulation. There's regulation in the UK, but how do you actually regulate a social media site globally? Because it's one thing that's everywhere, and different countries have their own different lawmaking parliaments.
It's very difficult, and I think in the EU, for example, under the Digital Services Act, they have taken a case against Elon Musk for Twitter X's role in disinformation and hate speech. Whether or not that is successful or not, and what the punishment is open to question. But these are global platforms. They're not media publishers. They're not held accountable in the same way as, for example, BBC Scotland would for the output for things they host. And until you change that definition, it's very hard to get them to take a stronger stance on hate speech and misinformation.
Okay, well, thank you both for joining us this morning, Dr. Suzanne Witten and Dr. Paul Riley.
It's 8:46 now. The famous but highly elusive artist Banksy's been very busy over the past couple of weeks. For 9 days, his pop-up art appeared all over London, ending with a piece on the shutters of London Zoo. James Peake produced a series of programmes for Radio 4. And in this week's Reporter's Notebook, he gives his own very personal impressions of Banksy's latest work.
For Banksy fans who happen